Welcome to the My Innovation Coach training webinar, Innovation is a Team Sport, Part 2. The topics last in Part 1 included the first three burger dots here. We introduced a useful mental model. I'll come back to that actually today. And then secondly, I spent a lot of time on culture. I think that's sometimes an underestimated factor in team performance. Culture permeates down to the team level, and so a supportive culture will enhance team performance, and a dysfunctional culture will negatively impact team performance. So we spent a lot of time on that. There'll be some topics associated with that today as well. And then we talked about team structure. For specific team structures, autonomous, heavyweight, lightweight, and functional structure. And the key there was that how you organize a team is really a function of the specific project. And the key insight, I think, is that just because you've organized other projects in a particular way doesn't mean that the next project should be organized in that same way. So you really have to understand the risk of the project and then choose the right project management structure. So those were the things we talked about in Part 1. Today I want to focus really more on team dynamics. We actually will not get through all of the topics today. I'll come back and finish up some of them in Part 3. But before I begin, there was an article that I had used about a study that Google did on about 150 of their teams and what the key factors were that they all had in common in terms of success. And there were 5 of them. And those included dependability, that team members get things done on time and meet expectations. 2, that high-performing teams have clear goals and well-defined roles within the group. 3, that the work has personal significance to each person on the team. And number 4 was the group believes their work is purposeful and will positively impact the greater good. And then finally is this concept of psychological safety, that the team members all felt safe talking to one another, bringing up issues, and that's important, obviously, in the team environment, that you do feel safe, that you're not going to be criticized by other team members or management for that matter. So those are the 5 key factors. The last 3, 4, and 5 really relate well to some of the topics that we talked about in Part 1 related to the culture and the purpose of a business and so forth. Meaning and impact really is related to giving everyone within the organization a reason to be engaged with the company. And that goes beyond financial compensation. This is especially important to millennials as they flood into the workforce. So this really relates back to that topic, and as does psychological safety, in the sense that that's a cultural type issue that, again, permeates down to the team level. If you have if the organization communicates well all up and down the organization chart and laterally across the different functional groups, then that permeates down to the team level. People will feel confident with open communication at the team level as well. So 3, 4, and 5 really relate well back to the topics in Part 1. And today, really, many of the things we're going to talk about are related to number 1 and number 2 in terms of team dynamics. So this was a nice article that that kind of bridges the gap between the topics that we talked about in Part 1 and what we'll talk about today in Part 2. So today I want to delve into team dynamics, and to begin with, I want to go back to the mental model that we introduced in Part 1. And the entire concept here in terms of team performance sits within the context of the culture, as I mentioned. So that's where we started last with the last webinar in Part 1. And then as you come in one level, then you get into the organization space. This really has to do with the business plan, strategies, procedures, really many of the topics that we've been talking about within this webinar series are related to this organization space and the procedures and policies and so forth. And of course, the project sits within the context of these two layers, so to speak. The project starts, it unfolds, and then the project ends. Today, really, though, we're going to focus, come in additional focus in terms of the team space, which is really team processes and behaviors. This is really the focal point of team dynamics. And then we'll finish up by coming in to the individual, the personal space. And this is really driven by individual diversity. It's really human factors that we talk about in this area. So these are the two things that we're going to focus on today. So let's first of all start with elements of team performance. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about team meetings, but I want to separate that out as a separate topic because of its importance. So this first burger dot really is that organization space, and then we'll come into the personal space. When it comes to team performance, there are three key elements, and I'll refer you back to this reference that I gave in part one. This is a really nice reference that much of what I'm going to talk about I pull from this in addition to my personal experience. But there are three key elements of team performance. Content, which is really what we're most comfortable with. It's the policies, procedures, it's the marketing document, it's the Gantt charts, it's all the content that we develop with the project. It's really why the project was started in the first place. Then there's the process, the team processes, how we actually get things done on the team. And then finally there's behavior, individual behavior on the part of each individual person within the team. So those are the three key elements. We're going to talk about each one of them in turn. Let's talk about content first. It's obviously the most visible, the easiest to understand of the three elements, and really, as I mentioned, is why the team was formed. At the beginning, the marketing document or the new product proposal that we've talked about in the past, the project plans, the Gantt charts, even all the drawings or work procedures, or that get generated as part of the project. That's what content is. And of course, as the project unfolds, additional content gets generated. It's really output from both the organizational space and the team space. And most of us, especially project managers as well as the folks on the project team, are very comfortable dealing with content. It's we do that every day. It's easy to wrap your head around it, so to speak. It's very visible, so we're comfortable dealing with it. Second is the process. So really the processes, as far as the team is concerned, these are temporary and based on the needs of the team and the project. So unlike other processes in the business that get implemented and then typically are in place for a long time as people come and go and so forth, team processes are not that way. They can be created specifically for an individual team. They might be changed from project to project, and they're really based on the needs of the team and the project. And that's really where project management comes in order to develop these team processes. And I would make a case that you can do that in the context of the lean methodologies, just like we do in product development, in the sense that you might start with a particular process and see how it works and continue to experiment. It may be that the process is not working. We're going to talk about that. And you have to step back, evaluate it, and maybe change it. So you can approach process development within an individual team in that same way. It's the most underestimated in influencing team behavior. This is, again, critical for the project manager to understand that. And it really plays a more important role than the content, because good processes basically can lead to very smooth running teams, and bad processes drag it down. If you've ever been involved in a project that runs, it's difficult. It's more than likely a result of bad processes, or that's one key element of it anyway. And of course, how you develop the process is going to be impacted by a lot of other things, the structure, organization structure, what kind of team structure you're dealing with, the nature of your phase gate development process, and what kind of processes that requires you to use, the type of project management tool you're using, if you're using maybe Scrum or the Agile techniques in software development, or lean methodologies, whatever project management tools you're using is also going to influence the processes. And then just the collective skills, the experience level, and how big the team is. All those things will influence the choices of the processes. There are 6 key processes. Team meetings, we're actually going to break that out separately and talk about that because of the importance of it, in my opinion. Roles and responsibilities, we saw this in the Google article. That's very important. In other words, that there are clear roles and responsibilities. Actually, we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of measuring performance. Communications, that's also was a factor in the Google article in terms of, clear communications enhance team performance, open communication, no fear of retribution. All those things are really, really important. Decision making, how the team makes decision, and measuring performance. And I've got a couple slides on each one of these topics here in a minute, so we'll come back to these two. And then finally, this concept of team feedback. I mentioned that you can develop processes with, say, the lean concept in terms of iterate and learn. Well, you do that through team feedback. Every once in a while, stepping back and talking to the team, and is it working or is it not working? Do we need to make adjustments? So again, project management is extremely critical in that aspect. All right, so let's talk about number 4 and number 5. First of all, decision making. There are 3 ways that we can make decisions on a team: autocratic, democratic, and consensus. Obviously, autocratic, where the team leader basically makes a decision, is best for really, really fast decisions, or maybe when the team is in crisis or the project is in crisis. That might be the best decision making. Or for inconsequential decisions, for instance, where the next team meeting is going to be located is not an important consideration, so that might be done best in this fashion. Of course, we all try to reach consensus. That's the common goal. But it can be difficult to achieve, and at some point, to move on, then you might start in a consensus mode, and then the project leader has to make a decision and move forward. There are a lot of ways that consensus can fail. For instance, you have no definition for what exactly is the definition for consensus. Does everybody agree to that? Secondly, there's no specific method for reaching consensus. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. And then a danger that consensus can be assumed if no one is voicing opposition. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to avoid that. And then there's really no process in place to resolve stalemates. How do you get past a stalemate? Now, it may be that at some point the project manager, has to weigh 2 different contested decisions or path forwards and just make the call. It might be necessary. And then, of course, the final one is maybe team members falsely agree to avoid conflict. As humans, we tend to want to shy away from conflict. We don't want to take the time. We don't like it. So that can be dangerous in terms of, of reaching consensus. And then finally, a lot of teams fall into this trap. If we just talk long enough, we're going to reach consensus, and that can waste a lot of time and might not lead to an effective decision. In my experience, sometimes it might, if you go into say a meeting to reach consensus, and it's clear that you're not going to get to consensus, you might be better off just setting it aside and coming back to it in a few days after people have had time to think about it, and you as a project manager have time to talk to individuals. So that might be the way to handle something like that rather than trying to force the issue. So there are some key techniques to build consensus. As we mentioned, that's one of the failure to reach consensus is can requires you to use some techniques to build consensus. And the first thing, particularly as far as the project manager is concerned, he or she really needs to know where everyone stands. If you really don't understand what people's position are, then you have no way of really reaching consensus. And that might not just be within the context of a meeting. You might need to go offline, talk to people individually, especially introverts who would not tend to want to enter a fray within a meeting. So you might need input outside of out of the meeting. Second one that I really like is this concept of a straw man proposal. I suspect most of you have used that type of concept where, in order to get the discussion moving, rather than having an open-ended discussion about trying to reach consensus on a particular topic, the project manager comes to the table, or somebody comes to the table with a specific straw man proposal, and it's a great way to kind of put a stake in the ground and see where people stand and debate that particular issue, and then hopefully from that you can start to hone in on the best decision and the consensus on that decision. As a team, you might want to try to step back and identify first, where are there going to be sources of conflict? What do you think the issues are going to be? And then that will help you, work around those types of issues to build consensus. The silent yes is and we're going to talk about a way to avoid that, but you have to be aware of that just because somebody is not saying anything doesn't mean they necessarily agree with you. And that can be extremely important, especially in the rush of trying to get something done. The project manager may really just want to move on, but in their mind, they've made a decision, but they're trying to get the rest of the team to come together, and maybe not everyone agrees. So you have to be careful about that, especially in really important decisions. Then there are stake in the ground type decisions. In other words, the team has to all agree that the decisions that you make cannot be infinitely rehashed. And I've seen that happen, where you think you've got consensus, you make a decision, and then you come back a week later and you're rehashing the same decision. So the team has to take it seriously, and that really needs to be kind of a ground rule that needs to be put in place that, look, as a team, when we make a decision, that's a team decision. And whether you agree with it 100% or not, it's the team's decision, and we can't keep coming back to it. And so I've seen that happen. The other aspect of that is making sure that you record things, you write things down, you have good team notes so that you don't rehash those types of things. The concept of the fist of five is a really great way to get around the silent yes in particular, and it's a very simple technique. I've used it effectively myself in projects. When you think you've reached consensus, and everybody's kind of nodding their heads or maybe not saying anything, you can easily go around the room and have everybody respond in this physical way, from 1 to 5 on their hands, from they oppose it to they will champion the decision. And that's a really great way to really gauge how strong people feel about a particular decision and whether you really do have consensus. If out of 6 people you really have a spread, then maybe you really don't have consensus in terms of that. And I've seen that play out in teams. And so this is a really effective tool to do that. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about is measuring performance, and this is a really simple way to do that. I like this concept of a task list. It's an easy thing to do. Hopefully you've used these types of things. There are other ways to measure performance, milestones and Gantt charts and so forth, but this is a simple way that is pretty powerful, where you've got a particular topic, you've got some notes, and then you've got somebody who's responsible for that particular topic. And this gets back to the roles and responsibilities and how important it is for individual responsibility and accountability across the team. So the really great thing about this concept is that, this is something that everyone has either before the meeting or after the meeting. You're building accountability within the team itself. So, obviously you want to be accountable to one another, and this is one way to do that, one way to build that accountability, so that when you make a promise, it's not in a vacuum. You're promising your other teammates that you're responsible for that. So it's back to this kind of concept that we are all for one for all type of thing. And so this is a really important part of measuring performance, but it also helps build that accountability across the team. So a really simple way to see where you are and what's happening. And of course, the other tools that we use in project management are other ways to kind of keep track of where we are as a team. Okay, now let's talk about a little bit about behavior. Team behaviors, first of all, the mission and objectives, the content is really easy, and that's really the focus of the project once we start. The processes, support those objectives, and they're relatively easy to see and understand, but they're very important, as we talked about. And of course, these are the tools and processes that guide the work, and they help guide behaviors. But behaviors, this third kind of key element, are much less obvious and more difficult to manage, because you're really dealing with human nature. The behaviors are human interactions and interpersonal dynamics associated with the execution of these processes. So, but they're more difficult. But the bottom line is, for you to be successful as a team, it's going to be dependent on people's behavior. Now, you might not be able to get everyone to buy in exactly from an emotional level on a team or a decision or whatever, but you got to be able to get the team to behave in a way that moves the ball forward, and you're not working against one another and so forth in order to be successful. There are really 6 key team behaviors. One is mutual trust. Obviously, I talked about this before in measuring performance. Actually, it was the third thing, accountability. But that you trust one another. When you promise one another that you're going to do something, that you will do it. So mutual trust is important. Interdependency, the concept that you're all, it's one for all for one. The team fails or succeeds as a team, and so that you're dependent on one another. Third is this concept of accountability. Again, I mentioned it in the measuring performance. You want to be accountable to one another, and that's a key behavior. And how do you build that accountability? It's based on trust. It's based on interdependency, and you want to be accountable to your other team members. And valuing the individual differences. Right? You need to all come to the table with that. Especially in today's work environment, there are people from all over the world, and there needs to be a value for that. I think it's a lot better today than it was, say, 25 years ago related to that type of topic. But, obviously people from different backgrounds are advantageous in a team context. We talked about that in part 1. That's obviously what one of the values of the teams is different skill sets that people bring to the table. Transparency. Again, many of these things came out in that Google article. Transparency is important, right? That you're transparent with one another, you're honest with one another, and that builds that accountability, builds that mutual trust. And you can see where all these things can be influenced by the culture within the larger organization, and that's why it's so important, and how, in reality, senior management's role in building the culture within the larger organization directly comes down to the team level. And if this permeates the organization already, then it will come down to the team level. But the project manager, is still responsible for making sure that happens at the team level with or without the support from the organizational culture. And then the final concept of learning and recognition, that you value that everyone behaves in a learning mode, that they're all trying to learn, and that you recognize one another as a team. So those are six very important team behaviors. Kind of to finish up this section, there are some rules for managing these three elements. Particularly as a project manager, when you're having a problem with the team, then you want to separate those three elements: the content, the process, and behavior. Is the issue associated with the content? Is it associated with the process, say the team meetings or however you're running the process, or is it associated with the behaviors? And you want to make sure they're consistent and not in conflict. You don't want a process that's dysfunctional, that's leading to these problems in behaviors. And as a project manager, you really want to look for these behaviors first. That's going to clue you in on what's happening, because that's really a fundamental factor in terms of people's feelings. So you can't ignore that, because that's what you're going to see first is behavior. And then you can kind of come back from that and try to figure out what's driving that behavior, how is the process influencing it, and how is the content influencing it. Of course, as a team leader, you want to make positive comments when you see different elements. This is something that actually, these three elements, it's kind of part of the rules for a project manager in terms of setting out the expectations at the beginning of the project in order to educate the team on these three elements, what they are and what you're going to be doing as a project manager to focus on them. And then as the project unfolds, as a project manager, to make positive comments on those elements when you see it, to reinforce that behavior, particularly within the team. A very important one is to admit mistakes in your behavior, not only from the standpoint of the project leader, but even for the team members themselves. And I would contend that it has to be modeled at the senior management level, again getting back to the culture within the organization. Saying that you're sorry for bad behavior goes a long way to diffusing a situation. And by you modeling that, of course, by the CEO, the head of the organization modeling it, filters down to the project manager modeling that, and then it will carry through to the team itself. So it's it's kind of an important part of this concept of transparency within the team. And then, of course, personalizing behavior reinforcement by using first names and eye contact, whether you're a project manager, leader, or even a team member. Okay, so I want to come back now. I mentioned that team meetings is one of the key processes, and I wanted to separate that out as a kind of a separate topic because of how important it is. As part of these webinars, I did some informal surveys of the folks that participated in them and asked them three questions. The first question was how much time they felt they spent on meetings. And there was a wide range of answers from 6 to 40%. The average was kind of 25%. This might be a little low. I had also incorporated an article from Psychology Today about meetings, and some of the data from there suggests that it's 40 to 50%. But the point that one person made is that sometimes when we are asked subjectively how much time do we spend in meetings, it might be inflated because we have such a negative view on the wasted time, and that's really the second question associated with meetings, that maybe we inflate how much time we actually spend in meetings. But question two is how much percent time you think is wasted in meetings, and again it ranged from 20 to 50%. The average is around 33, and that's kind of consistent with the larger survey data that's available. So people feel that about they spend anywhere from 25 to 50% of their time in meetings, and on average about 30% of that time is wasted. So you can do a quick back of the envelope calculation on your organization and suddenly realize that the amount of time that gets wasted in meetings is pretty substantial from a financial standpoint. And not only that, not only you're wasting money, and you're wasting time, which is very valuable and could be used for more higher value added content. So this is why thinking about meetings and how you're running meetings and spending time on the processes associated with meetings is so very important because of the cost implications to the larger organization. And the third question I asked was, what do you think hinders good meetings, impediments to successful meetings? And there were kind of three key things that came out of the survey: lack of an agenda, so there is no agenda going into the meeting, which kind of relates to the second one, and that's there's no focus. You get bogged down with tangential issues. There's not good facilitation to stay on track, so all these things are kind of related and actually could probably be related to the lack of an agenda. And then lack of preparation, both on the part of the team, whoever's running the meeting, and the people coming to the meeting. So those are the kind of the three things that kind of came out of that, of my informal survey of the participants in this webinar. And these come out in the article that I use from Psychology Today and other research that's out there. This is not too surprising. There are other things that came out: lack of follow-up, not clear exactly what the team accomplished, people coming late, the meeting not starting on time, political posturing. Sometimes people want to hear themselves talk and are talking for reasons outside of what is really necessary, so there could be some political posturing. The meeting length. And I put in parentheses here Parkinson's law, which says that if you set up a meeting for an hour, the very great odds are it's going to last an hour. And we talked about Parkinson's law in the context of developing project schedules. It's the same thing with a project schedule. If you say it's going to take you a month to do something, well, it will take you a month. So the implication here is you might want to consider, if you think that it's going to take you an hour, or you want to block out an hour of time on your schedule, that's a nice block of time, you might consider scheduling it for 30 minutes. And you might find that if you do have an agenda, are really clear about what the priorities are, that you can get things done quickly if you don't waste time and you get very focused and everybody comes prepared. So, I think this is a really important point, and something that I would encourage you to think about and take those meetings more seriously than maybe you do. Because we have so many meetings, I think we tend to, just take it for granted sometimes. And then the other thing that came out is scheduling conflicts, trying to get people together in the right time and so forth. In my informal survey, I had one person that made this comment related to this lack of follow-up and not clear what we accomplished. Follow-up doesn't mean another meeting, email, voicemail, text, chat, fax, phone, call, post-it, knock on the door, conversation at the urinals, all effective alternatives to another meeting. I think that was a kind of a humorous way to make the point that this person was trying to make, that, and this gets back to documenting what happened in the meeting, the follow-up, having clear follow-up, and if you don't write it down and issue a summary of the meeting, then you are going to fall into this danger here where it requires another meeting to talk about what you did at the last meeting. So I think that's the point that this person was trying to make in a humorous way. So there are some best practices. We kind of alluded, well, some of it we've already talked about. One is a formal agenda, right? Absolutely necessary. I don't care what kind of meeting you're going into. I always send out ahead of time an agenda in terms of the things that we want to accomplish and prioritize those. You want to establish, what are the key issues and what are the decisions that you need to make, and make sure that everybody knows that coming into the meeting, and that you, as whoever's leading that meeting, know that, so that you can put those at the beginning. You can drive to those decisions, and then maybe if you don't get to the rest of them, maybe it wasn't that important and you should put it off to the next time or whatever. Summarize what is agreed to and what decisions are made. Again, this gets back to the follow-up. If you don't write it down and issue notes, I always do that very soon after the meeting. Get those out when they're fresh in my mind, and ask people to make sure that I didn't miss anything. So extremely important. Going in with agenda, clear objectives of what needs to be accomplished, and then summarize quickly after the meeting's over. if you follow these three things, you will probably solve 99% of your problems with meetings, in my opinion. You want to have some ground rules. Again, this is something that you can do with the team, or if you're doing a meeting with people that you normally don't meet with, set out some ground rules how you're going to run the meeting. Now, for really large meetings, you probably want to use a facilitator. I frankly don't like meetings more than about 6 or 7 people. I think that they tend to be worthless. You don't get a lot accomplished. I think very, very large meetings tend to be for information only rather than really making decisions, or maybe they're just to review decisions. But you need to be careful about who comes to a meeting and what you're really trying to accomplish. You want to close the meeting with clarity. Summarize what you did and close it on a positive note, even though it might have been a contentious meeting. I think people walking out the door, you want to have a positive impression of what you just did, even if it was contentious. It might have solved some problems. There might have been some issues that came out that weren't on the table before. So that might be a positive thing. Learning, you more than no doubt learn something in the meeting that you can take away as a positive. So even if you didn't accomplish what you set out to do, there more than likely are some positive things that happen, and happened for a reason that will be positive down the road. Now, there's some other things to facilitate team meetings. One is this concept to go slow to go fast. This is really about, at the beginning of the project, the team leader sits down with the team and goes through the processes on how they are going to run the meetings and what the expectations are. That there's going to be an agenda. I expect you to come prepared. I expect you to not talk over one another. Whatever those kind of rules are, you want to set that expectation so that you can manage those behaviors in a positive way in order to make sure that you get done what you got to get done in those meetings and that they don't waste time. As a team leader, you want to only do one process at a time. You don't want to be talking about a problem, trying to identify what the problem is, and at the same time trying to create a solution. So be very conscious of running multiple processes at one time, and I've seen that happen time and time again. It's easy to fall into that trap. You as a project team leader or whoever's running a meeting, you need to focus that and get it back on one topic. Use process checks. Step back from time to time and make sure that the team has enough energy. Why are you losing energy? Do you need to maybe just end this meeting and come back to it later or whatever? And do we really need to solve this particular issue that we're talking about right now, or can we put it off? Agree on the 80-20 rule. Sometimes, in product development, we don't need 100% solution. It's the same thing in meetings. You might just need to agree that 80% is good enough and then move on. There will invariably be a lot of issues that come up that are off topic, and so you need to learn to park those issues, write them down, document them, but you don't need to work on everything that comes up in the meeting, and otherwise you'll go off on all kinds of tangents and waste time. And then finally, you have to know how to open and narrow your thinking, particularly as far as the project leader or the team leader is concerned, or whoever's running the meeting. There's a time to open up the conversation and get a lot of ideas on the table, and then you need to narrow down your thinking. So it's the concept of opening and closing your thinking. And you might have to do that all within the context of a 30-minute meeting. So you need to think about that going into the meeting. There are some good opening techniques. Of course, brainstorming is the classic one. This is not going to be a brainstorming session here in terms of talking about all the ways you can do that. There are multiple ways to do that. I actually think things like the slips of paper technique, where you go around the room with slips of paper, or do it even offline with some of the software that's available now, is probably better than a freewheeling type of approach. I think you get more accomplished with some of these other techniques. But brainstorming is a classic opening technique that you can use. This concept of the force field technique, a way to explain that is, let's say you're struggling with a decision about what motivates us to assemble something in-house, what motivates us to assemble outside. You brainstorm on different answers to that question, and then it helps you frame that problem. So now you can turn to narrowing your thinking and coming to a decision. This concept of power dotting, I think the easiest way to explain that is maybe with an example. Several years ago, I was involved in trying to come up with a new name for a software product. So we reached out to the larger organization, came up with a list of maybe 25 different names, and we got together in a group of about 8. You take the number of ideas that you've got, 25 let's say, and divide it by 3. Then that's the number of votes each person in this small group had. So we went around the room and you vote for your top X number of ideas, and you keep doing that round after round, and you will find that you can hone down on a larger list and really now be able to narrow your thinking and come to a decision. Again, using the fist of 5 that we already talked about is a narrowing technique. So we talked about that. You can use that here. And then the final one on that list was selection criteria. It's a pretty easy concept. We actually talked about this in the context of portfolio management. You could do the same thing when you're looking at to help make decisions between different market opportunities. But the concept here is, you got different criteria. You might weight them. And then you've got these alternative solutions, and every team member scores each of those alternative solutions and that particular factor on a scale of 1 to 5. You average it out, you weight it, and you come up with a weighted total. So it's a really nice way to narrow your thinking on various alternative decisions that you might have to make. Okay, so that was the the team space that we talked about in our model. Now we're going to hone in on the personal space. So we just dealt with issues associated with team dynamics and team space. Now we're going to come down to the individual level and personal space. And the question when it comes down to each of us individually is what influences our behavior? I mean, that's what manifests itself on the team at an individual level in the personal space, is how we behave in the team. And it's really quite complicated. What you see, there's a lot behind that, right? So this is kind of my view of the model, so to speak, of what drives our behavior. And the first thing you have to understand is that our brains are wired, the emotional part of our brain processes information, processes emotions at multiple orders of magnitude faster than we can rationalize. So the first thing that happens is we have an emotion. We don't even necessarily consciously understand it or sense it, but we have an emotion, and these emotions are percolating around, very, very rapidly within our brain. And then if we take the time, we then try to start to rationalize that emotion. Now, I would make the case that there's probably needs to be a dotted line from emotions to behavior, and that some people, and sometimes if we're tired or we're hungry or circumstances are just right, we're under a lot of stress at home, sometimes our emotions get the best of us, and before we rationalize, we react and behave. You've all done it. I've done it. Gets back to where, it's important to apologize for that kind of negative behavior if it is negative. So you have to be careful of that and understand your own triggers for that. And as a project manager, when somebody behaves, you need to go back to that and try to understand what happened there. Why didn't that person rationalize before they reacted? Is there something going on with that person? In terms of our rationalization process, I think it's affected by our value system, which can be influenced by things like our culture, our cultural background, our experiences, our personality type. So let's just talk about those briefly before we end today. Of course, culture, our cultural background has a huge influence on how we behave, in our value system. And especially today, you look in most organizations and they're very multicultural. People come from a lot of different backgrounds, and people come to the table with different perspectives. If you've been involved with folks that are from some of the Asian countries, nonverbal communications, how open they are. These are things that are much different compared to Americans in particular, who tend to be very verbal, very wear their emotions on their sleeve type of thing, are very open, both positive and negatively. So you need to understand where people are coming from. If you have dealt with some of the countries in Europe as well as South America, the value of time is much different. So all this plays into how we rationalize our emotions and how it affects our behavior. Secondly is our experiences, and in general, the impact of one factor related to our experiences is when we grew up, our generation. And there are, 4 different generations right now. Well, actually more so 3 in the workforce right now. But we think differently. So myself as a baby boomer value and think much differently than the millennials do. And so that will drastically influence, our behavior. And so you need to understand where people are coming from on your team and how that might play out. There are, of course, a lot of other individual issues with experiences, whether it's job history or family background, maybe the influence of religion. There's all kinds of things that can, based on our experiences in life, that affects how we rationalize and ultimately how we behave. And then finally, personality types. We all have natural tendencies on how we think, learn, and process information. If you haven't explored this a little bit, I think it's worthwhile doing. There are some very common tools. The Myers-Briggs is a famous one. It's based on 4 ways to experience the world. Divides people into 16 types. I happen to be what's called an ISTJ, which is pretty typical of engineers, I would say. So, this is a nice tool to understand how you think and how people on your team think. And that's one tool. Another tool is based on this concept where people are divided into 4 major groups: idealists, guardians, rational, and artisans. Typically have characteristics of 2, but one is usually dominates. And all these things can help explain how people behave. So this one divides it into 4. You've got the idealistic person, who's very thoughtful, selfless, very caring, very sympathetic. And then on the other end, you got the artisans. These are the, let's go for it type of personality. Very fun-loving. Don't necessarily, can't execute necessarily, or not rule followers, but can be very creative. And I've known a lot of people like this. Sometimes it's tough to control them in a meeting, and it's tough to get them to follow the rules, but they can have a great value with the team. But they behave a lot differently than an idealist, and they certainly behave a lot differently than the guardian or the rational. I happen to be a rational, very goal-oriented, and I probably have a little bit of guardian in me as well. But I'm an engineer, so I'm more analytical, more systematic, logical, but also am very organized and a strong work ethic and so forth. So, you need to think about the people on your team and what they bring to the table and how that plays out in terms of their behavior, and it might explain a lot of their behavior to you. My final thought on personal values versus work values is that work for most of us represents our greatest challenge to personal values. So when we join a company, we either fully accept and embrace the company's values, or we rationalize and modify our own values so that they're not in conflict, or you leave if there's no alignment. And so I think it's very important as a project leader to understand where people are related to this, because it can help explain a lot of things and help you manage their behaviors. There are basically, I think, three ways people identify and understand the company values. Of course, what's written down, the company's vision, objectives, all that kind of stuff is important, but probably not as important as what the company's policies and what their key decisions are. And then even more important are the behaviors of the people within the organization, both from the management level and your peers. So that's really how people, in my opinion, primarily gauge the company's values. And so there's this constant assessment going on where people are looking for how people are behaving within the organization and what the company values and their own value system, and whether they can rationalize and accept it or they can't. So again, I think this is very important when you look at people's behaviors, and even as much and even related to their engagement within the organization is related to this topic. Okay, now there are final two topics that I had wanted to cover, but because of time, I'm going to come back and these will be included in part 3. And then the other topic in part 3 is I want to go into some issues associated with how you can support teams. Thanks for attending this My Innovation Coach training webinar.